May 19th, 1692. Under the cold mist of the English Channel, history's greatest gamble is about to be played. On the shores of Normandy, 20,000 soldiers hold their breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. An exiled king waits for his final chance to reclaim his throne. And out of that mist glides a human-made monster, the Soleil Royal, a floating fortress of 104 brass guns, adorned with gold-leafed sculptures, and the unshakable pride of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Her mission is impossible, her orders chilling. Attack the enemy wherever found, no matter their strength. But as the mist clears, what awaits the French is not just the sea, but a wall of 82 massive English and Dutch warships stretching across the entire horizon. 44 ships against 82. As the 5 bloodiest days the seas have ever witnessed are about to begin, no one knew that the fate of this magnificent fleet hung on a decision as small as a grain of sand. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the battles of Barfleur and La Hougue, the naval engagement that Churchill called the Trafalgar of the 17th century. But before we get to those burning ships on the Norman coastline, we need to understand what France was actually attempting, and why Louis XIV's finest admiral sailed into battle already knowing the odds were suicidal. The roots of the 1692 campaign lie in the glorious revolution of 1688. James II, Catholic King of England, had managed in the space of a few years to alienate almost everyone who mattered in English politics. The Anglican Church, the Protestant nobility, Parliament. When 7 leading English noblemen wrote to William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, inviting him to come and take the throne, William came. James fled to France. William and Mary were crowned. Louis XIV saw an opportunity. James in exile was a chess piece, a legitimate claimant to the English throne who could, if restored, bring England back into the French orbit and destroy the Protestant alliance that was slowly assembling against France across Europe. Louis gave James money, troops, and the use of French harbours. He sent him to Ireland, where Catholic support was strong, hoping that Ireland could be used as a base for the reconquest of England. It did not work. At the Boyne in 1690, William's army broke the Jacobite forces. At Aughrim in 1691, they broke them again. The Irish resistance ended with the Treaty of Limerick, and the soldiers who refused to swear loyalty to William, between 14 and 20,000 men, sailed to France rather than submit. History knows them as the Wild Geese. They formed the Irish Brigade in the French army, kept their red coats because they considered themselves still the legitimate army of England and Ireland, and remained available for exactly the kind of invasion that Louis was now planning. By 1692, Louis had assembled a striking force on the Normandy coast. 20,000 soldiers, Irish and French, ready to board ships the moment the fleet cleared the way. The Wild Geese were the heart of it. Men who had left Ireland rather than swear loyalty to William, who had kept their red coats as a statement of who they still considered themselves to be, who had actually staged a minor mutiny when issued with the grey uniforms of the French army, because they would not give up the symbol that connected them to England. These were not mercenaries, they were soldiers waiting to go home. The plan was to cross the Channel, land in England, and restore James to his throne before the Protestant alliance could respond. Louis had also received intelligence from Jacobite agents embedded in the English fleet that many English naval officers were secretly loyal to the old king and would change sides the moment a French fleet appeared in the Channel. It was exactly the kind of wishful intelligence that gets armies destroyed. Admiral Russell assembled his officers aboard his flagship before the battle and had every one of them sign a declaration of loyalty to William and Mary. There were no defections. The man tasked with clearing the way was Admiral Anne Hilarion de Tourville. He was one of the finest admirals France had ever produced. A sailor since childhood, a veteran of Mediterranean fights against Turks and Barbary pirates. The hero of Beachy Head in 1690, where he had driven the Anglo-Dutch fleet from the Channel in the last great French naval victory. He understood what was being asked of him in 1692, and he did not like it. Tourville's problem was numbers. His Mediterranean squadron had been caught by storms in the Straits of Gibraltar and turned back. His Rochefort ships were delayed. The vessels he had left at Brest were short of men. He could put 44 warships to sea. The combined English and Dutch fleet had 82. Tourville sent to Paris explaining the situation and recommending against engagement until the rest of his fleet could join him. The reply from Louis and his naval minister, Pontchartrain, was unambiguous. The king's orders were to fight the enemy wherever found, whether strong or weak. The French phrase was fort ou faible. If Tourville thought he could not obey, the king would find someone more willing. Further dispatches were sent to cancel this order when Louis learned the true scale of the imbalance. But those dispatches never reached Tourville in time. A lesser man might have found a reason to delay, a fog to hide in, a mechanical problem with the flagship. Tourville was not that kind of man. On May 19th, he sailed to meet the combined fleet, with 44 ships against 82. What happened that day off Cap Barfleur was, given the odds, remarkable. Tourville knew he could not win a straightforward line engagement. His tactics were to extend his line as far as possible, to prevent encirclement, concentrate on the centre, and use every navigational advantage the weather and tides offered. He had his best captains grouped around his flagship, the Soleil Royal, and he intended to make the English pay heavily for whatever victory they achieved. The fleets engaged around 11 in the morning. At the centre of the battle, the Soleil Royal was engaged simultaneously by the Britannia, the London, and the St Andrew. 3 first-rate English ships against 1. She took terrible punishment but held her position for hours, her gunners returning fire with a discipline that their opponents acknowledged with respect. Around her, the battle developed with the grinding intensity of 17th century line tactics, ships hammering each other at close range, gun after gun, deck after deck, until something gave way. The scale of the fighting's worth pausing on. These were ships carrying between 60 and 100 guns each, firing iron balls that weighed 12 to 42 pounds. At ranges sometimes measured in yards, the effect on wood and men was catastrophic. Splinters from shattered planking killed and maimed as effectively as the shot itself. Ships that had been built over years and cost fortunes were reduced to floating wrecks in an afternoon. And through all of it, trained crews continued to load and fire because that was what they had been trained to do, and because the men on either side of them were still standing. In the early afternoon, the wind shifted, giving the Allies the weather gauge. Rear Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel saw an opening in the French line and drove through it, catching the French centre in a crossfire. The Dutch under Allemande extended around the French van, threatening to encircle them entirely. Tourville responded with the agility of a man who had been sailing these waters for decades. He anchored his ships with their sails still set, which held his position while the current carried the Allied fleet past him, buying time and separation. It was a brilliant manoeuvre, and it worked. By late evening, the battle had effectively ended. No ships had been sunk on either side. An extraordinary fact, given the ferocity of the fighting. Tourville had his fleet withdraw in 3 groups in the darkness, trying to reach Brest before the English could gather themselves. He almost made it. Almost. The problem was the tides and the anchors. The Normandy coast is one of the most technically demanding stretches of water in the world. Enormous tidal ranges, complex currents, channels that reward local knowledge and punish those without it. Tourville's fleet, short of good anchors because of peacetime economies in the French dockyards, could not hold position against the tides. Ships began to be swept toward the coast. 3 of Tourville's heaviest ships, including the Soleil Royal herself, ended up beached at Cherbourg. 12 more ran aground along the coast near Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue, directly adjacent to the beaches where James's invasion army was waiting. Admiral Russell had them now. He sent his fireships and longboats in, while his main fleet stood off in support. The operation that followed over May 21st through 24th was not a naval battle in any traditional sense. It was methodical destruction. At Cherbourg, Captain Thomas Heath took the fireship Blaze to within pistol range of the Soleil Royal and locked his vessel against her hull. The greatest fighting ship in the world burned to the waterline. The Admirable was boarded and her crew taken prisoner before she too was fired. The Triumphant followed, 3 ships and the symbol of French naval ambition, reduced to floating wreckage in a single afternoon. At La Hougue, Rear Admiral Sir George Rooke led the longboat attacks personally. What happened there had a quality that participants remembered for the rest of their lives. The French ships had been beached for protection, with shore batteries and cavalry covering them. James II and his Irish troops were watching from the beach. They could see exactly what was happening, and there was nothing they could do about it. One English longboat ran aground in shallow water and came under attack from French cavalry, who rode into the surf with swords drawn. A British sailor picked up the boat hook, a long pole used for managing the boat, and used it as a weapon, unhorsing a French cavalryman before the boat was freed and the attack continued. The detail made it into the dispatches. Ship after ship went up. James watched 12 French warships burn in front of him. His invasion had no fleet. There would be no crossing. He would never return to England. And then he said, loud enough for the soldiers around him to hear, that only his brave English tars could have done such a thing. He was complimenting the men who had just destroyed his chances. The remark went around the French and Irish officers like a cold wind. Tourville survived, returned to France, and 2 years later won a significant victory over an English convoy at Lagos. The French dockyards worked quickly. They built replacements for the lost ships within a year, including a new Soleil Royal. France was not broken as a naval power by La Hougue. Part of the reason so many French ships escaped at all was the extraordinary skill of a Breton sailor named Hervé Riel. When a large group of French warships tried to escape around the Channel Islands, they faced the Alderney race, one of the most dangerous passages in European waters, where tidal currents reached speeds that could dash a ship on the rocks in minutes. Every French navigator on those ships refused to attempt it. Riel, a crewman who knew those waters from childhood, volunteered to lead the fleet through. He brought every one of them safely to Saint-Malo without losing a single vessel. The Dutch admiral who had been pursuing them turned back rather than follow through the race. When Riel was asked what reward he wanted for saving the fleet, he asked for a single day's leave to visit his wife. The English poet Robert Browning wrote a poem about him 2 centuries later. But something had changed that was not a ship. Louis XIV had spent years building the greatest fleet France had ever assembled, with the explicit intention of contesting the sea as against England and Holland together. The money, the men, the strategic priority, all of it directed at achieving what the French called guerre d'escadre, fleet action, control of the sea lanes by force of capital ships. After La Hougue, Louis made a decision. The fleet would still exist, but it would no longer be sent out to fight the English fleet directly. The resources that had gone into maintaining battle squadrons would be redirected into something different. Guerre de course, commerce raiding, privateers attacking English trade rather than English warships. Jean Bart, René Duguay-Trin, and their kind would carry the war to English merchant shipping instead. The economics of it made sense. England and Holland depended on trade. Disrupting that trade hurt them where they were vulnerable. What it meant in practice was that after 1692, France never again sent a fleet to challenge England for control of the Channel. The privateers did real damage, but the invasion fleets, the great battle squadrons, the ambition to dominate the seas, those were over. The consequences accumulated over the following century. British merchants traded with less competition. British dockyards had time to develop and improve. British admirals and captains accumulated experience and doctrine through decades of action against a French enemy who had largely opted out of fleet warfare. When the wars of the 18th century came, and the French did occasionally attempt to contest the seas again, they found the gap had grown very wide. Trafalgar in 1805 is the battle that ended French naval ambitions for good. But Barfleur and La Hougue in 1692 were where those ambitions first broke. The Soleil Royal burning at Cherbourg, James watching his invasion fleet destroyed at La Hougue, 82 English and Dutch warships filling the Channel horizon against 44 French. These were the images that defined what naval power would look like for the next 100 years. That is what happened at the battles of Barfleur and La Hougue.